Chapter 26 Grieve. Of all the submissions I received for this book, far and away the most numerous were stories about experiencing the presence of God after the death of a loved one. People relayed stories of how God had been subtly or dramatically present at the time of loss. This surprised me. What surprised me was not the stories of the sacred coming to life. Rather, it was the ordinariness of those who wrote to me. These were generally not pastors, philosophers, or psychologists. These were plumbers, housewives and house husbands, middle management types, nurses and cashiers from Walmart. These were mostly everyday people. One such person was Anne. Nearly 4 decades ago, can it have been that long? Our first child, a son, was stillborn. It was a complicated pregnancy, and I nearly died after the delivery. I was in the hospital for a few days, recovering, and was allowed to go home for Christmas Eve. That evening, my father stayed with me, while the rest of the family, all of whom had gathered to mourn, went to church. While my dad and I were alone in the family room with the Christmas tree lit, I turned toward the tree, deep in grief. As tears rolled down my face, I distinctly heard a voice, which my dad did not hear. The voice told me that I would not go another Christmas without a child. The following December 4th, our daughter was born. Although my father, who was diagnosed with lung cancer the previous year, did not live to see her birth. Anne is one of those people who, from her youngest days, always had a sense of knowing God, even before she was able to call it by that name. This was how she introduced her story of multiple experiences of being cared for, watched over, or guided by a presence she was unable to describe. But the most profound occurrence was around the time of the death of her adult daughter. Yes, another loss in her life. Anne was returning from a weekend away and had unexpectedly made changes to her travel plans. After several unexpected delays, a police officer informed her of the tragic news. Friends and family gathered for support, which helped soothe her shock and pain. But more than that, or perhaps combined with that support, Anne also experienced what she describes as a warm, divine embrace, which comforted her. And although it did not entirely remove the sting of death, it allowed her to rest in the warmth and comfort of care. This encounter was central to her healing and grieving. Anne is not the typical type of person I'd imagine experiencing this kind of divine intervention. She's a classic church attender, a seeming consumer of all the church culture offers, from altar guilds to fellowship circles to various committees. Anne carries with her a deep sense that God is with her every day. When she described several other experiences of divine protecting presence, I began to view her differently. She is an everyday mystic. Her openness to spiritual encounters, combined with her just like the rest of us appearance, made me wonder, who else like this is in our lives? One of the reasons so many people have profound divine encounters around death and dying is because of our connection with the resurrection of Jesus. The power of the Easter story of Jesus' resurrection is more significant than as a past event that happened 2,000 years ago. Resurrection is happening to us, not merely has happened. It is a present and future tense action by the Holy Spirit. In other words, she is resurrecting you and me. In the words of Eugene Peterson, in his book Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, resurrection is primarily a matter of living in a wondrous creation, embracing a salvation history, and then taking our place in a holy community. In Chapter 1, I described breathing as an active, everyday participation in this holy life. The first human is brought to life by breathing. God breathes life into earth and mud as a way of birthing Adam. The ruach of God is that Hebrew word for breath. In John's story of Jesus, he reminds us of the power of ruach in his telling of Jesus' resurrection. As Jesus appeared to his disciples while they are locked away and hiding in fear, he says to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." John 20:21-22. This combination of shalom, breath, and Holy Spirit brings full circle the power and presence of God in all of life. There at the beginning of creation, and here again at the birth of a new creation. In the days before his crucifixion, Jesus spends time preparing his disciples for what will come. Through a long and involved conversation, he readies them for his leaving by promising his coming. Jesus may die, but the Spirit is coming. This refrain of leaving and coming continues in John's story to the very end, when Jesus breathes. As Yahweh breathed life to the first human, now Jesus is breathing life into all creation. Death is our common denominator as humans. We both fear it and are fascinated by it. Shakespeare wrote of ghosts and visitation. Movies today portray encounters from the other side, and average people know the hauntings of that thin veil that separates life and death. William wrote me about the events surrounding his father's death. He and his father had a pleasant but distant relationship over the years. Not unlike many father-son relationships, there was a cordial awkwardness. When his father died as an old man, William recalled the afternoon following the funeral. I went to my father's home, where he had lived for most of his adult life. Once inside the door, I found myself drawn to the upstairs, where I could hear a clanking sound as I entered his bedroom, and I saw that the window was open and the curtains were billowing in the breeze. There at the foot of the bed sat my father, who turned and looked at me and smiled. It was a kind smile, unlike any I had ever seen on his face. Suddenly a gust of wind came through the window, the curtain flew up, and my father was gone. I've never told anyone about this encounter until now. These stories reflect different ways in which people connect with God. Can it be that in death we discover life? Is there something about the finality of life that opens us up to an awareness of God? Does our participation in the resurrection that has happened and is happening make us more keenly aware of the presence of the divine, the sacred? There is a theme in many people's spiritual lives. The poet Maya Angelou captures both the loss and the hope we experience around death. In this excerpt from her poem, When Great Trees Die, we read of the process of grief. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always, irregularly. Angelou offers these comforting words that people can cling to while in grief. The long path of walking through the valley of sorrow is indeed irregular and slow. The length of this path varies widely for people. Months would be rare, years or even decades would be more common. As I sat at lunch recently with several friends discussing the trials of a colleague who was nursing his adult daughter through cancer treatment, one member of our luncheon group announced that he had lost a child to cancer. "You never get over it," he said. "It's with you forever." Then, after a long silence, during which none of us knew what to say, he added, "You somehow keep going. It's the strangest thing. Life desires to keep going." One statement I frequently hear from people in grief is their experience of the unexplainable. Perhaps one hears a voice, as we saw in Anne's story above. Sometimes people describe sightings or visual phenomenon. At other times, they have an intuitive sense that something or someone is with them. These various spiritual encounters are more common than we admit. My estimation, from years of ministering to people in grief, is that about 50% of all people have some unexplainable occurrence. It's as if we are more open to another world during grief. In 2008, I was preparing to depart for a mission trip to Rochester, New York, with our high school youth. The trip involved a week of service projects in the inner city. On the Tuesday before our weekend departure, I got a phone call that one of our key members, a hero in the local community, had died. She was in her late 40s and a central figure in our town as a beloved veterinarian. What made things even more difficult was the news that she had taken her own life. Suicide is the hardest of griefs. The combination of the sudden jolt of the event, along with the guilt on the part of those remaining, poses particular challenges. Because of the scheduling of the funeral, I remained behind to conduct the memorial service while our high school youth and adult leaders traveled to Rochester. In the days leading up to the funeral, I immersed myself in conversations with family members and consultations with psychologists and read a variety of literature on the topic of suicide. I wanted to lead a funeral service that would genuinely provide resources for healing. My prayer was an honoring of this woman's life, a sense of hope to the surviving family members, and a reminder that God is gracious. After the funeral, I flew to Rochester to meet our group, still consumed by this funeral, this sad loss of an amazing woman. Upon landing in Rochester, I had a sudden urge to visit the George Eastman Kodak House Museum. Eastman was the founder of Kodak, the renowned film company that dominated photography for most of the 20th century. I've been a photographer since my youth, and had once applied to the Rochester Institute of Technology when I considered pursuing a career in film. I arrived at the Eastman House and had the most peculiar experience of being led inside. I was walking through the museum as if I knew where I was going, yet I'd never been there. I went up the stairs, past many exhibits that I had wanted to view, but I did not stop. Instead, I was lured, as if led by someone holding my hand with clear determination. Finally, I arrived upstairs in George Eastman's master bedroom, drawn to a display case of several items, including a small, handwritten note. I leaned over and read George Eastman's note. My friends, my work is done. Why wait? Signed, George Eastman. I read the description next to the display. What I had just read was George Eastman's suicide note. He took his life in 1932 at the age of 77 with a gunshot to his chest. I stumbled back from the display and almost fell over. Sitting down on a bench in the next room, I was overwhelmed. What had just happened? How did I know? I didn't know. What brought me here? What was going on? Questions, confusion swirled in my mind. I made my way to a restroom where I splashed water on my face. Stunned, I eventually wandered outside into the hot, moist summer afternoon and sat on the concrete steps of the George Eastman house. For close to an hour I sat in the shade, my mind racing, then slowing down, eventually, gradually, to a place of calm. I composed myself, made my way to meet our youth group at a nearby high school, and joined them for dinner and a week of service projects. In the months and years since that event, I've heard various theories about what I experienced. A psychologist helped me understand it as a profound encounter of synchronicity, a theory developed by Carl Jung, who defined it as an acausal connecting principle. The simplest explanation of synchronicity is that sometimes events are connected by meaning as opposed to cause and effect. A spiritual director once guided me through meditation and attempted to explain this event as a message from the holy, a word designed to shake me from what might have become an obsession with suicide. Then I had a conversation with a young evangelical pastor who was intent on me viewing this as angels steering me toward the museum. When I asked, okay, but why? For what purpose? He couldn't provide an answer. I told the story to a family member who is an atheist, and she said, it's just a coincidence. I've come to believe that there is a thin veil between life and death. We are all but one breath away from moving between those worlds. Somehow, I was profoundly touched by this death, this woman's suicide. I was so enmeshed in grief that I was drifting and in need of grounding. The march to the museum was a way for me to encounter a sudden and dramatic slap to the face, not in a negative way, but in an instructive way. I believe that somehow the Holy Spirit was involved in this moment of healing, but not in a way that I can entirely rationally understand. She was doing her work, and something was happening, but I was having a hard time comprehending it. I have intentionally included several stories in this chapter that confound the logical. We've come a long way from everyday spirituality. But have we? My reason for pushing a little further here towards the end of this book is simple. I think many people have had close encounters of the divine kind, but they are not so sure they can tell their stories, not sure their friends or fellow church members will accept them, not so sure they won't be laughed out of the room. I know people want to express these mysteries and connect with others who have. Can we create safe places for people to talk about the strange? Can you be a person who is open to listening to the unexplainable? What story or experience would you be willing to share if you found the right opportunity? If you are reading this book as a part of a study group, can any stories of the sacred be shared? I once preached a sermon that consisted of 4 simple, peculiar, unexplainable God moments. I was guest preacher in the congregation, so I didn't know any of the people. During a discussion group after the worship service, an older man burst forth with a story from his younger days. He offered an account of hearing a clear guiding voice of God's Holy Spirit. It changed his life, both in terms of his work and his family. He'd held on to that story for 60 years, never revealing to another person. I'm hoping these stories have given you permission to tell your story.